The Rundown, Part 15, a far-lost story by John Miro.
Twilight fell upon the darkening road. I found myself again alone. Street lights went out by one, by two, by three. Now reveled in the shadows that had grown. Yes, I reveled in the darkness I had known.
It was too early in the day, Ada thought, lifting the hot mug of tea. His hand stopped just short of his lips. He used to love the mornings. Where did that thought come from? He wondered, but instantly chuckled, knowing the answer. There was a lot to get used to after a move. Starting with, Jane Kelly was not a morning person. Ada stared out the window ahead, overlooking Piertown, and took a sip of the tea. He was surprised by the taste and made an appreciative sound. He'd joined with Jane much earlier in life than he had with Duncan, his previous host, and her taste buds delivered an explosion of flavor to his senses. He set the cup down, still savoring the taste, and noticed the newsfeed playing on one of the 6 massive floor-to-ceiling windows ahead. Manta, Skanen, and human reporters were all jockeying for space on the steps of the Piertown Hospital. Ada swept the long black hair covering the right side of his head out of his eye. The scene at the hospital had something to do with the Roland Bird escape during the attack on the pier, he was sure. He brushed the collar of his silk robe, a nervous tick he'd picked up from Duncan. Roland Bird and his unknown human accomplice had already been preying on his mind. It couldn't be a coincidence Semet and Murdo wanted 2 sentients smuggled out of town, no questions asked. Since the request had been made, Ada had heard alarm bells. They were offering a lot in exchange. But what would the fallout be, to Ada and to his city? Ada never took work, no questions asked. On the other hand, he was smuggling someone out of the city, not in. Murdo and Semet were big players in Piertown, but they weren't big players beyond Locklaw. They were tied to the Sky City. They couldn't pack up and move out, so that ruled out death and carnage on a large scale, didn't it? Semet wasn't crazy. Murdo, maybe, but not Semet. Still, smuggling was their stock and trade. Why offer Ada a king's ransom to do it? Were these sentients Semet wanted out of town, no questions asked, tied up in something he didn't want his fingerprints on? Perhaps they were evidence of something the half of the police force not on someone's payroll could use as a smoking gun against Semet, and that's why the crime lord wanted them out of the city without having his fingerprints all over it. Ada put an arm on the back of his chair. He watched the reporters preparing their cameras and microphones, letting the question of Semet and Murdo's request roll around in his mind. On one hand, a regular client was asking him to take on an unknown risk. On the other hand, Semet was offering Ada a fortune in lieu, and a favor to be named later. He sensed an opportunity here, but was it worth risks he couldn't even calculate? "You asked for this," Ada muttered to himself, and laughed. Yet another of Duncan's lines. A small ache tore at his heart. He missed his friend so. Still, Duncan had been suffering. Even Ada's hide metabolism could only extend life so far. In many ways his ending had been a blessing. Ada's grin showed hurt in it, conjured by the memory of the emotions and energy swirling in Duncan as he fought back against the frightened, hateful children that had killed him. He'd had a great life, and got his licks in at the end, too. That would have been important to Duncan. His old host had been right, though. Ada had asked for this. He'd built the roadhouse, cultivated his contacts, and made centuries of decisions because he continued asking for this. His conscience bore the weight of so many decisions, good and bad, and all came at a cost weighed in sentients' lives. But those lives would be spent, one way or another. Just like Duncan kept swinging at his killers, unarmed and undermatched, Ada would never stop fighting. Never stop protecting. The ache of Duncan's passing was affecting his emotions and his judgment. He knew it. He had to put those feelings away for now. He closed his eyes and thought back to a time before Locklaw, before the dragons, before Farlost. A time when he had lived inside moors, and he and the Manta had flown above their ancestral forest, laughing and chasing their children. He savored the memory from so many hosts ago, then opened his eyes to again face the here and now. As Counselor Underwood walked into the frame on the news ticker filling the window, Ada leaned forward. "Spillane, turn that up, please." "Why don't you ever let me eat my bacon hot?" boomed a deep Skanen voice. Spillane leaned over to lumber through the door to the kitchens. Pounds of bacon lay steaming on a steel platter, held by his second, smaller pair of hands against his green and black chitinous chest. Powerful legs flexed beneath the elastic black pants he wore. Ada leaned forward to rise, but Spillane held out one massive upper-clawed hand. "No, boss, let me," the Skanen rumbled. "You're still adjusting to a new body, I get it. Everything must be so awkward inside your hot new female host." He crossed behind the bar and tapped something onto a glowing screen laying on the long, real wood bar top. "Let me take care of everything. I'm happy to serve." Ada smiled. Spillane was happy to serve. Happier when he got to bitch about it, sure, but he was happy and loyal. And Spillane was right, Ada admitted, as he turned his attention back to the screen displayed on the window. "I'm still acting like I'm living in a 200-year-old man's body." A lot to get used to, he thought again, before Counselor Kree's high manta shriek dragged his attention outwards again. "Decades of system guard embargoes, hundreds of nation-states occupied, 500,000 dead in the civil wars to defend Locklaw, families destroyed and innocents killed, and now Counselor Underwood wants us to aim our guns away and invite the guard puppets running Haven SG to fly right through our pier. I say no!" The small crowd of onlookers growing behind the reporters gave a ragged cheer. "I will defend the city against this treasonous act," the Manta politician roared again. "I serve the city!" "Pants on fire," Ada sneered. Kree was another regular in the roadhouse. His own wings were coated with the same blood he was painting the system guard. He served himself, and Ada had his name in a file, along with the proof, as life insurance. Ada had a lot of names in his files, along with insurance, against retaliation from most of them. But then, he thought, as Bennett Underwood took control of the stage with the ease, some politicians were better at hiding their misdeeds. "Citizens," Underwood murmured, and the crowd fell silent. "We all arrived here from distant suns. Survival was a struggle. Under the dragons, well, it was almost impossible." He nodded, talking slowly, and Ada watched the audience let him. "The system guard destroyed their tyranny. All of you came together to defeat the dragon's tears who would not release our city. Now, through our hard work, through our sacrifice, we are free." Ada leaned forward. Even through the screen, tens of kilometers away, he could feel the pride of the crowd swell as Underwood addressed them masterfully. "The system guard are no different than any of us. They arrived here, frightened, hurt, in a place ruled by centuries-old hatreds, a civilization almost totally controlled by tooth and claw. The guard have acted poorly, yes, but haven't we learned the way to end the suffering and rebuild?" Counselor Underwood's face looked as tired as his words, and the audience was transfixed. "Only through reconciliation and forgiveness can we rebuild and expand our fortunes. I believe if we extend that forgiveness to Haven SG, together, we can become even greater." Bennett Underwood reached a hand onto the shoulder of a tall man with blond hair and Asian features, dragging him closer to him and into the frame of the camera. Ada froze as he recognized the man's uniform was System Guard. Friends, I know. Haven SG has ties with the System Guard, and it is natural to fear them for that. The Guard have chosen some roads that are hard to forgive, but they are not demons. I know you're all thinking these talks with Haven SG amount to capitulation to the Guard. Not true, not at all, but I want us to extend a little of that reconciliation and forgiveness we have learned here in Locklaw, yes, to the Guard itself. Look, they're just people like us. This man is just like us. Ada could almost hear the spell Underwood had cast pop like a balloon. Some in the crowd began to shout out. Ada narrowed his eyes at the display. It wasn't like Underwood to make such an amateurish mistake. "They're murderers, all of them!" a man in the crowd screamed. "Keep the Guard and Haven out!" boomed a deep Skanen voice. "String him up!" shrieked Amanta. The last call was answered with a bloodthirsty roar. "Have you finally backed the wrong horse, Bennett?" Ada wondered silently. "No." Underwood's voice, pitched like a father's, aimed at the crowd as if they were a child that had shamed him. "How can you hate this man? You don't even know him. You don't know what he's lost." The crowd wasn't just silenced by his rebuke. It was as empty of sound as the vacuum of space. "This is Donald Tyson. He was born a slave on a pirate mining colony in the Winter Belt. The System Guard freed him and his brother and hundreds more just like him. They fed him, they sent him to school, and yes, asked him to fight for them. How is that any different from what you want for your children?" "Our kids ain't killers," a woman's voice spat. Underwood shook his head sadly. "No, ma'am, they are not. And neither is Officer Tyson. He's just a man who was given another chance to exist, him and his brother, and he became a police officer. That's what brought him here today. This man came to Locklaw to bring Roland Bird to justice." Ada's mouth hung open. Pieces were clicking together in his head. Cree floated into frame during the shocked silence that followed, the graspers by his mouth shaking with rage. "Counselor Underwood, I congratulate you for possessing a heart so full of love and forgiveness." The fat Manta politician's high voice dripped scorn. "But this is no orphan boy. This is a killing machine trained by the Guard." Ada watched Tyson's eyes dart from the human politician to the Manta politician, confusion and anger warring on his face. Nobody let him in on the plan, whatever it was, Ada surmised, and he looked none too pleased to play the role he'd been set up for. "I'm not a killer, Mr. Cree farted and moved several feet from the release. "Not a killer? Why do you think the Guard saved you from those pirates? To be cannon fodder, or to kill the children of all the nation-states bravely defying the boot heels of your Guard?" Underwood pulled Tyson closer. The bigger man didn't look at all happy about it. "Killers, Counselor?" Underwood challenged, looking every inch a father again, defending his own blood now. "Yes, the Guard have made horrible mistakes, but we can't teach them from behind a closed border and a fleet of warships. This man may have made mistakes. I don't know all of his story." Ada snorted. He doubted Underwood was in the dark about much. He was clearly planning something big here, and Cree obliged him by walking straight into Underwood's crosshairs. "But I know his adopted brothers," Underwood roared before Cree's open mouth could issue a retort. "Sala Tyson survived slavery in the mines to become one of the System Guard's soldiers, yes, but then he turned his back on war and retired from the System Guard." Cree's wings were rippling. He finally sensed the trap, Ada knew, even if he couldn't see its final shape. Underwood shook his head in sadness at Cree and turned to the cameras, his face lit by pride. "Donald Tyson gave up on soldiering to become a policeman. He has devoted the last decades of his life to working with the Guard's allies and non-aligned states in neutral territories. He clapped Tyson's shoulder. "This is a good man, just like his brother Salah, who left the guard uniform behind to become a shipbuilder with cash." Ada's face went slack, sensing the shape of the trap even before Cree or any of the crowd spellbound by Underwood's words. Underwood's face darkened. Salah Tyson was the pilot on a fateful voyage we have all seen footage of. A family brutally tortured and murdered, along with Salah himself. Underwood turned his gaze back on Cree. Ada could feel the weight of the crowd shift with him. Salah gave his last breaths, pleading for the lives of the crew, not for himself. Donald Tyson is here to bring the terrorist responsible for the Kesh Shipyard's massacre to justice. Will you stand in his way, counselor? Cree was speechless. Even the rippling of his wings had ceased. He'd been beaten, and he knew it. "No," Cree said in a small voice. "No, I won't," he said, even stronger now, and swooped around to lay a mouth-grasper on Officer Tyson's other shoulder. "Thank you for your service, Officer Tyson." The manta's mouth was pressed tight with emotion Ada suspected was rage at being outplayed, but could still pass for compassion on the camera. "Welcome to Locklaw." The crowd cheered, applauded. Women cried. Spillane groaned. "Oh, brother!" Ada heard the Skanden's claws scratch controls, and the screen winked out, revealing more of Piertown and the Ringway line in the distance. "Game, set, and match," whispered Ada in growing awe and fear of Bennett Underwood. He stood and paced, worrying more mental puzzle pieces into position. "Boss?" Spillane's voice was surprisingly gentle and surprisingly close. Ada stared up at his friend, saw the Skanden's mandibles twitch with concern. He saw Jane's delicate features reflected back at him in Spillane's 6 black eyes, all swiveled towards him on their eye stalks. "I do so hate politics, Spillane. Give me an honest criminal any day." Spillane laughed, munched another piece of bacon, and returned to the bar. Ada returned to his seat, pulling a slate from the pocket of his silk robe. He set it on the table and gestured in the air above it, pulling a small holo of the same press conference and conjuring a listing of his private files into the air beside it. The crystal-clear hologram showed the press conference breaking up. The politicians all filed back inside. The camera's view panned from the top of the stairs to the bottom, focusing on a reporter verbally regurgitating the affairs for those viewers joining late. Ada reached out to close the feed with a wave of his hand, when a familiar shape broke through the police line, behind the reporter, waving a badge, then loping up the stairs to stop Guard Officer Tyson. Inspector Nicodemus Usher grabbed Tyson by the elbow and dragged him to the side of the building and out of sight. "This is another fine mess," Ada muttered to himself, and then moved his frozen hand to dispel the video. Another hand wave, and the sensors in the slate began recording. "Good morning, Jane. I trust you slept well." He kept a gentle smile on his face, hiding the concerns beneath it from the camera and the woman he needed to discuss things with. The woman whose consciousness slept inside their shared body as Ada guided it through the world, and through a coming tidal wave he was only beginning to understand. You have been listening to The Rundown, a far-lost story, written by John Miro. Learn more at servingworlds.com. Opening music, Everything Is Not What It Appears, kindly provided by Nate Maingard at natemaingard.com. Closing music, Full On, by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. If you like what you hear, you can become a patron and support more stories at patreon.com/servingworlds. Thanks for listening. See you next week.